So today I want to talk about what I consider the two most important features for any show, piece of media, game, card game, video game to have to maintain engagement from the audience and retain longevity. And I think that those two features are power creep and consequence. Especially consequence, I think, is the most important feature for any piece of media to have to keep audience engaged. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think not a lot of media people and game developers know this, because I just keep seeing new pieces of media being put out and I consume most of it, especially new games that come out, and very few of them hold my interest. And I find myself gravitating to older games like RimWorld, Battle Brothers, Mech Warrior that I've already played for years, and I come back to those same games and I still get the same entertainment from them. Similar with Yu-Gi-Oh! Why is it that when I play current Yu-Gi-Oh! I can't play it for more than maybe 1 or 2 hours. Maybe I'll get a couple games in and then I'm done. But then I go back to Goat and Edison, like the original formats of the game or older formats of the game, and I will be overnight all day playing the game, right? I'll from Saturday to Sunday, just not even sleep, just playing one match after the other. Why is that? I want to talk about that because it's something that I'm realizing more and more how important it is. Now, first couple of things I'll say before we start the video. Number one, I mentioned this on my last video. I am super sick. I found out that I've had influenza this entire time, so I probably sound more terrible than usual. The second thing is, obviously, this is my subjective opinion. Not everybody has to feel the same way. People don't like the same things, but at least for me and a lot of people that I know, a lot of the lack of or continued engagement with a piece of content or game or media will usually come from these two features that I'm mentioning, and I'm going to explain why I think they're so important. I'm going to go over specific examples, specific shows that made use of this and when they became uninteresting because they stopped making use of them, and the same thing with video games and Yu-Gi-Oh! Different card games as well. So let's go ahead and talk about a show that I think is a good example right off the bat of both of these features, both power creep and sense of consequence. So Sword Art Online. Sword Art Online is one of my favorite animes, but I only liked the first season. I did not watch more than once or found myself entertained at all by the second season, and by the season 3 Gun Gale and whatever else came after that, I just completely lost interest. But the first season, absolutely loved it. Why is that? So let's start with the power creep, right? So Kirito was already overpowered from the very beginning of the anime. He was already, the beta tester, the god player. He was already amazing. But that's how he was set off from the bat. So it's not like we saw him go from this very unskilled player and grow to be, this extremely good player later on that could just dominate the game, right? There was no proposition that was set from the beginning of the show where he was unskilled. He was always skilled. So there was no real power creep issue because he was always powerful. Another show that is a great example is Dragon Ball. The characters have always been able to blow up the planet. That's not new. They just maintain that, they get more powerful, but pretty much they've always been extremely powerful. It's a show that never was grounded from the beginning, and that is an advantage for it. And similar with Sword Art Online. What Sword Art Online had a problem with was consequence. The reason why the first season was so good, if you've never watched, Sword Art Online, you've been under a rock. Basically, it's about these kids that get stuck in a game where the developer locks all these players into this game, and if they die in the game, they die in real life. So everything that they're doing, every time a character dies in the game, like, it doesn't matter that they're inside of a VR video game, because anything that happens to them, they will get hurt in real life as well. So when someone dies, when something happens, it is heartbreaking. There is a sense of consequence. You get worried and tense for the characters because at any moment there is a realistic, chance that they could die in real life. And that's why shows like Shangri La Frontier, which are great too, but didn't engage me as much, that is the reason. It's because they don't have that sense of consequence. It's just a VR video game playthrough where there's no stakes, right? If they die in the game, they don't die in real life. It wasn't as interesting as it was entertaining to me. And the same thing with the following seasons for Sword Art Online. They weren't as interesting to me or anything after the first season because they weren't stuck in the game anymore. And there's no sense of consequence. If they die, they just respawn. So what's really the point? And I think that like I said, a lot of media developers and game developers, they don't seem to realize that when you start making things overpowered, you deviate from the original premise of what made a show good, or you lose that sense of consequence that a show once had. That's when, at least for me, I tend to lose interest on all those pieces of media. I'll quickly use just another example of an anime that did this for me as well. My favorite anime of all time is Naruto, right? I loved Naruto the entire hundreds of episodes until we got to the last Great Ninja War. When we started getting towards that point of the anime where we stopped basically being ninjas and everybody basically became a god and everybody could blow up the planet if they wanted, deviated so hard from the original premise of the show and characters became so extremely overpowered that I completely lost interest on the show. My favorite show of all time, suddenly towards the end, the climax, everything has been building up to this point. I was no longer interested and I didn't watch most of it because the characters were just so strong. It wasn't interesting anymore. There didn't seem to be a sense of consequence. It didn't seem like, even if people could die, it just deviated so much from what the characters originally were supposed to be that I lost interest. And that's why I use Dragon Ball as an example, because Dragon Ball was already about, and has always been, about these overpowered characters that can blow up the planet. Nothing really changed. It just maintained that premise. And I think that a big problem that a lot of these shows have, and I'll talk about games in a minute like Yu-Gi-Oh!, is that they deviate too much from their original premise and they go crazy. Consequence stops existing. It stops being grounded in it. There's too much power creep and it deviates from the original premise of what made the show good. And I see this in video games a lot. Talking about consequence now instead of power creep, I'll use video games as an example. As I get older and older and I approach my get off my lawn years more and more, I seem to gravitate over and over to the same types of games, and I find myself going back and playing the same games. And even though I try the newer games, most of the ones that come out don't hold my interest for very long, even if I give them an honest shot. The last one I played was Palworld, the newer game that came out that I played, and it was great for like the first 8 hours, and I lost interest after that, and I went back to playing RimWorld. RimWorld and Battle Brothers, I have over 2,000 hours on them on Steam. Battle Brothers, I think it's like 2,200 and something. Why is it that these games are so interesting to me? Well, it's because I play them with permadeath. So an Iron Man mode, right? So anything that I do in the game at any point, if the characters get injured, if they die, there's no going back. And that keeps the game always interesting, replayable, and grounded, and anything that you do has a real sense of consequence. As soon as I play any of these two games, especially RimWorld, if I save scum on the game, if I die or something bad happens and I reload the game, I start very quickly losing interest on the game. If I turn on God mode too often and I start tweaking certain things, that's when it completely ruins the game. And it doesn't ruin it to where I want to go back and play with consequences. Like I need like a month break from the game because I completely lost the joy and value in that game. It's so weird. As soon as something, it's not even just about it being challenging, because that's a component as well, but the consequence I think is so much more important than the challenge, because RimWorld, there will be long periods where there's no challenge going on, especially if you're playing with Randy Random as your storyteller. There's long periods of time where there will be no consequence, and then out of nowhere, bam, something hits you and you could lose everything. It's that tension that keeps you on the edge of your seat, that at any moment, if you stop caring or you get careless, you could lose everything that you've been doing for like the last few hours or whatever. Same thing with Battle Brothers, and that is what I think is so interesting about these games, and that's what keeps you replaying the same games over and over, is that sense of consequence. It's not just the difficulty, but it's mainly the sense of consequence. This is a reason why I think a show like Goblin Slayer was so good as well. Nobody in Goblin Slayer is a superhero, right? I think that the Goblin Slayer does a really good job of staying grounded in the sense that it seems that at any moment someone could get stabbed and die. At any moment something horrible can happen, as we see straight up from episode 1, right? Our heroes, they get hurt a lot, and they're put in situations a lot of times where they're unconscious, where they seem to be near death. They're not all powerful, all knowing, even if they're very strong, like the main character is very knowledgeable. That's where it's more coming from a place of knowledge and experience. It remains grounded. But when he gets hurt, he bleeds just like everyone else. When he's about to die like everyone else. And there's real consequences, if you've seen the show, of what can happen if he dies or they don't win a battle or whatever. If you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about. There are real consequences, and that show kept me on the edge of my seat the entire time I watched it. And that is the reason why. It's because at any second, it seems that any of the characters, including the main character, could die. Even though we know the main character is probably not going to die, it feels like he could die at any moment. And at no point does he turn into like an omnipresent, all-powerful god that can blow up the world, right? That's another thing. He's still the same guy he was from the beginning of the show to the end of the show. I think that a lot of shows, and especially games, they will change their original premises and what made that show great for the sake of innovating and for the sake of continuing to release new episodes and continue to making money. And this will completely ruin different pieces of media. I'll give an example now for Yu-Gi-Oh!, which doesn't quite share on all, it doesn't really share on the sense of consequence, but it shares on a problem that is very big called power creep. Now, when Yu-Gi-Oh! Was originally invented, if you're not a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh!, you don't know what I'm talking about, there were certain orders and certain things that needed to happen in order for other things to happen. So most people know the Dark Magician, right? Or the Blue Eyes White Dragon from the original show. So those two monsters took 2 tributes to summon them. So that was a big deal because you had to get 2 normal summon monsters, so you can only summon 1 per turn. They had to survive the 2 turns, and only on the 3rd turn you could sacrifice both of them and summon the Blue Eyes White Dragon or the Dark Magician, right? It was a big deal when you did that. And they weren't immortal. You could still get rid of them. They're monsters that don't really have effects or anything. You can still protect them, but generally speaking, it was a big deal when you put them on the board. It was hard to get that possibility of having the opportunity to do that because usually your cards will get destroyed before you get to the point where you can do that. So it gave this sense of accomplishment when you were able to summon him. It made it that much cooler and gave it that much more of a sense of you did something good and cool when you were able to summon them. Whereas the new game, the summoning and having to tribute summon, first of all, most decks, the vast majority of them, you will never tribute summon in the game again. If there's a deck where everything can't happen on turn 1, that's a bad deck. And I think that it completely took away from the original premise of what made the game good, which was a little bit of a tension buildup, where in order to do things, there was a certain level of, okay, I was able to put 1 card on the field. Let me see if I can protect it till next turn. My opponent now gets to make his turn. Oh, he wasn't able to destroy him. Cool. Now I have to, for another turn, be able to keep another card on the field until I'm able to, on the 3rd turn, put another one in. So it created this back and forth where the opponent had the opportunity to always prevent your plans or come back, or there was this high reward if he wasn't able to, that you would be able to summon a big boss monster, right? Versus now, pretty much all your boss monsters need to come out on turn 1. And if they don't come out on turn 1, you will probably lose because then the other opponent on their turn 1 is going to basically win the game. And that is what makes Yu-Gi-Oh! In particular so boring for me now. It seems that there is a complete disregard for how the original game worked. There is a disregard for a sense of accomplishment of the things that you're doing. That is something that I talked about a lot on this channel, is that I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a board-breaking game now. You will summon 5 different boss monsters on turn 1 with Omni Negates. Pretty much on turn 1, if your opponent wasn't able to stop your engine from going off, you basically lose the game. It doesn't feel at any point like a game could be turned, and I think that that's a really key feature there. At any point, a game could be turned, and that is not the situation with current Yu-Gi-Oh! Meaning, we go back to that sense of consequence. It feels like everything you're doing at any point, the opponent could have some sort of back and forth, and you could lose. Attacking you directly, the last few bits of life points that you had could cause you to lose the game. Now, it's pretty much, I set up unbreakable board turn 1 and I win, or I'm not able to and you win, or you're the one setting it up. I either draw the out or I don't, or it's over. When you feel like there is no chance, you just forfeit every game, or every game that you're about to lose or the opponent forfeits. Somebody made this comment on my last video, and it's true. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is now a game of getting your opponent to give up versus getting them to 0 life points. That's really not the case anymore. You're mostly just trying to set up a board in a way where your opponent can't play the game or do anything and he has to give up. There is no back and forth. There is no sense of possibility of consequence. It's either you already know you're going to win or you already know you're going to lose. That killed the game. Goten Edisons still have a lot of that, which is why I still play them a lot. One of the things I do a lot with my friends till this day is we play a lot of D&D or similar games to D&D, right? And one thing we make a point to add to these games is a sense of consequence. So if you die at any point in the game, there is some significant, you don't lose the game, right, completely, but there is some sense of some debuff major that you get, or some major loss of XP and losing all your gold, things like that. We make very harsh consequences for dying in the game because that truly affects the way you play the game and the decisions that you make. Like if you don't, I'm sure most people know how D&D and RPGs work, but it's a game of decisions, right? So let's say if you're immortal, right, and there is no consequence for you to dying. Okay, you come up to a dark room and you see this gigantic monster, right? Well, if there's no consequence in fighting it or not, and trying, why not try, right? Okay, well, you die and that's it. Nothing happens. You respawn, and now it's the next player's turn. Okay, then why not try? If there is a consequence that at any point you could die, you will try different methods. You will try sneaking around him to get to the treasure or whatever. You will just give up and leave. You will try to run. You will make more realistic decisions based on your mortality if there are real consequences to what you're doing, and the game becomes much more interesting and everybody's much more engaged. And I think it's the same thing that comes down to why gambling is so fun. Like, I hate to talk about this, but I love gambling. I love playing blackjack. I love playing poker. And these are games that I've played my entire life. And I will still, if I'm able to, I will still overnight play them till this day. I love playing blackjack and poker. I love going to the casino. But they are only fun if there is money involved. If there's no money involved, none of these games are interesting. Why? I think it comes down to the same thing. Why is D&D or RPGs only interesting if there's a sense of consequence? Because there's that sense of gambling, that sense of risk, that sense of your decisions matter. You got to commit to the things you do, because if you die, you could really die, or you could really have some major consequence happen. The same reason that goes back to why I like playing most games with Iron Man or permadeath on is because, again, anything that you do at any point could make you lose the game, could make you have to restart. So it completely affects the way you play the game. You will do things and act differently and play differently if there is no sense of consequence to everything that you're doing. If there is a sense of consequence, it makes it 1,000 times more engaging and interesting. And again, I don't think that a lot of media people and game developers know this, because I see the same mistakes in games happening over and over. Like, I'm a big fan of like Assassin's Creed. I love Assassin's Creed, but especially the newer ones, the gimmick wore off and they don't really engage me for that long, because when you die, you just respawn. There is no consequence. And unless there's like some sort of gambling involved, unless there's some sort of, if you die, there's some sort of, you could have to restart the game and lose everything. Unless there's some real stakes at hand, I lose interest in things very quick. And I'm finding that the older I get, for whatever reason, this is becoming more and more important. Like, I really don't care. I see sometimes these discussions on Facebook where they'll put like a picture of Naruto, Luffy from One Piece. They'll put a picture of Goku from Dragon Ball. Oh, which of these is the strongest character? And then people are having all these debates about who could blow up the planet more times over and whatever. I find that so uninteresting. What would be more interesting to me is discussing that between characters that can die and are not that powerful. Right? It gets to a point where some of these characters become so powerful that it's just not really that interesting anymore, right? And Dragon Ball kind of gets a pass because Dragon Ball was always like that, but I'm just using it as an example. It seems that these companies seem to think that the more powerful a character is, the more interesting that makes it, or the cooler that makes it. And at least for me, it's much the opposite. It's about a sense of mortality and consequence always. And I think that a lot of these developers are losing sight of that. A lot of these developers are also losing sight of what made their piece of media interesting from the beginning, what originally made it compelling, like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example. And they're deviating into this power creep problem where things just get crazier and crazier in order to either continue making episodes or in order to continue selling cards. Like even the original Yu-Gi-Oh, which I love, a big problem I had with that show is that Yugi never loses. He maybe loses once, I think, the entire show. But generally speaking, when push comes to shove, Yugi's not going to lose. He's going to feel the heart of the cards, open some imaginary door, and he's going to draw exactly the card that he needs, right? I get it. It's a show. It's a cartoon. but you start losing interest when you feel like, why am I even watching if the main character is always going to win? I remember when I was watching Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, one of the first duels, Jaden loses. And I was like, oh, shoot. So the main character loses. That made me interested on the show even more. Because now, from there on out, whenever the main character plays, even though it does revert back to mostly the main character winning, which makes sense, right? That's the premise of the show. But that show would have been able to hold my engagement for even longer if there were constant matches where the main character loses. That kept me interested because every time I watch, there could be something crazy that happens that makes the main character lose the game. When you always know that the main character is going to win no matter what, it loses that sense of consequence and it becomes uninteresting. I really think that these two things, controlling power creep and maintaining a sense of consequence, two secret ingredients to the sauce that will keep something interesting for as long as it can be interesting and replayable for as long as it can be replayable. And that is my opinion.